My name is Gene Xu. I'm an ABC. That's American-born Chinese.
I think really important to put education and how history is taught into the proper cultural context.
At the intersection between America and China, I'm concerned about the lack of cultural awareness on both sides.
It's really unfair to think that the American version of history is the one that is absolutely correct, especially you think about historians.
But I'm still optimistic about the future for my unborn son. Generational ABC podcasts are my conversations with my unborn son, one ABC to another, in my attempt to explain our world in context in order for him to make better sense of his world, which will be nothing like the world we live in today.
If we don't understand Chinese culture or we don't share their values, how do we become more empathetic to the environment in which they were raised? Good morning, little buddy. I'm getting a little bit used to talking to you every morning. So let's see. Today, I want to talk about education. When you grow up, obviously education is going to be a very important part of your life. So one of the things that I think kind of comes to mind when we talk about education is history and the importance of history. But it's also, I think, really important to put education and how history is taught into the proper cultural context. And the reason that I say this is because there's a saying, I don't know exactly how the saying goes, but it's something like history is written by the victors of war, which means that when there is a war that's fought, the country that is victorious generally writes the history. And this is, I think, definitely the case. America or the United States was basically the largest victor in both World War I and World War II. So largely how the events transpired, what led to war and all of that stuff, that was written by Americans. So the American narrative of world history or global history has almost become, at least from the American mindset, how things actually happened. So it'll be interesting that, as China rises and China is opening up these kind of Confucius institutes all over the world, a lot of people in the West think that China wants to spread its quote-unquote propaganda, but it's just, the United States has only been around for about 250 years. China has been around for, over 3,000 years. So I think it's really unfair to think that the American version of history is the one that is absolutely correct, especially you think about historians. So historians all have their own values, their own ideology, maybe even some of their own prejudices. So the way that historians write history, and then the way that students of history study history and then talk about history, that just becomes kind of a narrative that a group of people have. So everybody who's educated in America has basically the same common understanding of history. Whereas everybody who was educated in China, the 1.4 billion people in China, they all grew up with their version of history. And this is where a lot of the political discussions can kind of get contentious, especially right now in the situation between the United States and China. There's also a very interesting thing happening with education is that a lot of the traditional classroom education is now being replaced by online education, which means that you go to traditional schools and you get taught by teachers who have to go through a pre-prepared lesson that probably some governing body has to approve, and then everybody learns that version of the textbook. But things today evolve so quickly that if you wait for some textbook to be approved and then learn it, then you may be kind of not really ahead of the game. You'll be kind of just learning what was happening in the past, but it's not really preparing you to react or be successful in the future. And so that's one of the big things going on. So one of the things that your father is doing, which is me, is I'm trying to develop some online courses and programs, not to talk about the history of China or even the history of China's relationship with the United States, but more about personal development. And that's if we don't understand Chinese culture or we don't share their values, how do we become more empathetic to the environment in which they were raised? And I think that's extremely, extremely important if we want to form successful relationships with everyone, is to have a certain level of empathy and not to be judgmental, because what we learn and what we think is right doesn't always conform with what other people think is right. So again, we're just starting off with these podcasts, and I'm just starting to get the hang of talking to you, even though we only see you right now in this ultrasound and you're still only about this big. And you don't even have a name yet, so I just call you little buddy. But after you have a name, maybe I'll change the title of the podcast, or I'll start calling you by your name. But until then, I'm just going to try to develop a habit of talking to you every day for about 5 to 10 minutes, and try to pick a topic that I think has dramatic contrast between America and China, because we're at a turning point in history right now where China is trending up, America is either flat or maybe trending down in many areas. And the question is, when you're old enough to watch this podcast, China is definitely going to be the number one's largest economy, but the question is, where will America be? And hopefully we won't be in another kind of global conflict because the two sides can't resolve their ideological differences. All right? Thank you, little buddy. Looking forward to seeing you very, very soon.
Listen and subscribe on Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, or YouTube.